Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about Android, the operating system.
Do you want to sit?
No, I can stand. I, in fact, prefer standing. I'm going to do a quick overview of what Android is as an operating system and then go into some of the issues that it faces as an open source project and as open source people, the issues that we have with Android as an operating system. And hopefully I will provoke some discussion. This talk probably won't go for very long. So if I get some ideas going and we'll have some discussion at the end, that'd be great. I'm also probably going to say a whole bunch of things that are wrong and that I have no idea what I'm talking about. If people think I'm saying something wrong and that feel free to tell me that I have no idea what I'm talking about. I would.
Full of crap.
Yes, I am. So Android's this operating system, right? It's published by Google for portable devices such as phones and tablets.
I think you've got lots of idea what you're talking about here.
Oh, I said something true?
Yeah.
That's really not a good place to start.
Should we keep score?
Disclaimer I just had. If you like. So yeah, it apparently runs on tablets. I know very few people other than myself who have Android on a tablet, but it does run on them. And it primarily targets ARM-based machines. Apparently Intel have put out some x86-based Android tablets, but I haven't seen them on the market, so they can't possibly be doing very well. And it's nominally an open source system, which is kind of cool because we like open source stuff here. And this graph says there's quite a few Android devices out there in the wild and that hundreds of thousands are being activated by, with Google on a daily basis. So the latest estimates were that about 800,000 Android devices were being registered with Google per day at the end of February, which means that there are now about 300 million Android devices in current use. And that's just counting the ones that are certified by Google and people register their Google accounts with it when they first get their phones. There are crappy knockoffs from China, which don't have all the Google stuff in them and clearly won't activate themselves with Google.
I've got one. It's called AONOL tablet.
Anol? Very good.
It's an anal tablet running ice cream sandwich. $99.
If you want to find out about these crappy Chinese things, you should talk to Matthew Garrett. He has great opinions on them. So yeah, there are 300 million known Android devices out there in the wild. And what this means is that there are now 300 million Linux-based devices in the hands of consumers out there, which I think is pretty cool. We probably couldn't have imagined that there'd be this many people using Linux systems personally even 2 years ago. We wouldn't have had an idea that would happen. But Android as an operating system is quite different from what we're used to on our desktops and our laptops and our servers. So what I'm going to talk about is what's inside Android and the issues for free and open source software. So to start with an overview of Android, you need to have an idea of what an operating system looks like. At the middle of the operating system is a bit called the kernel. This is the bit of software that talks directly to the hardware that's in your computer. So it has device drivers. It's the bit that gets invoked when your computer first starts up, or almost when it first starts up. Outside the kernel is what we call user space. And user space, they're not necessarily programs that you as a user interact with, but they're pieces of software that don't need direct access to hardware. So this is the vast majority of software that you'll have on your machine. And then sort of, even though there's not really that much of a distinction, I'm going to make one anyway. I'm going to call it the interface, which is basically the software that interacts with the outside world. You as a user, or perhaps server software you have on your machine, things that face the outside world in some sort of way. I'm going to... Does that work? Yes, it does. Great. This is why you don't video conference your talks, or at least why you mute people when you do video conference, and it's weird. And there's also this bit at the boundary of the kernel and the user space, which is called a C library. And a C library is basically what you have so that you can write software that doesn't target a specific operating system, so that you don't have to write code that directly talks to the kernel if you're an application developer. So this is probably one of the more important parts of a Unix system in particular. When you have a Linux system, the kernel is the piece of software called Linux. You have various libraries that comprise the user space, and then you have a graphical user interface or a user interface of some description. Things like the X windowing system, KDE, GNOME, those sorts of things. And the C library that's used is the GNU C library, or glibc.
Strictly speaking, it's not quite an interface between the kernel and the user space. glibc tends to be a fairly thin wrapper around the actual system call interface.
Yeah, well,
Just in case anyone was interested.
but the system call interface is provided by the kernel.
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, it's a technicality, but yeah, strictly speaking, what you say is true, but it's not hugely important.
You asked me to crap.
Oh right, okay, yes, okay. So let's count one for where I'm full of crap. Thank you, Thomas. So these GNU core utils and glibc are part of the reason why Richard Stallman insists that you call your operating system GNU Linux. Yeah, it's the resemblance is quite uncanny. That's not the photo that I took, but the photo that I took, Michael is basically in an identical outfit to RMS. It's quite funny. But yeah, so Richard Stallman insists that you call it GNU/Linux for some reason, because he insists that the GNU software is more important than everything else that comprises a Linux distribution these days. He may have a point, he may have had a point, he may not have one anymore. I'm not going to argue that. So the question is, what sort of things on a Linux system do you have on Android? And the answer to that is not very much at all. Basically, you have the Linux kernel, and that's the only part of most Linux systems that survives into Android as an operating system. So while it's a Linux system per se, it's actually very, very different to the Linuxes that you use on your laptop or your desktop. So there's the Linux kernel, and then the most important piece of user space code or user space programs that you have on Android is this thing called the Dalvik VM, which is a low-level virtual machine that applications target. It's basically so that developers only need to write their applications to target one particular machine, as opposed to the various types of ARM-based CPUs and various types of x86-based CPUs that Android operating systems could potentially run on. So people write their code in Java, but instead of targeting the Java virtual machine, they target the Dalvik virtual machine. And the user interface that you target is this custom thing that's written for Android. It doesn't use X11 like Linux systems do, primarily because it's designed from the ground up for doing touch stuff as opposed to interaction with a mouse, because X11 was invented in the 80s and touchscreens weren't really around then. And they also developed their own C library called Bionic, which is good on ARM-based devices, I guess. I haven't read too much about it, but I know that it's there. So the question you may be asking is, how Linuxy is this system if the only bit that survives is the kernel? A friend of mine has a full Debian system running inside his Android system on a Transformer Prime tablet, so he can do all of his development work on his Android tablet because it has a keyboard dock and all that, and he does all his development work in Vi. So you can basically run everything that you would run on a Linux system on Android with a bit of work. If you follow that Google query, you'll see a whole bunch of resources for getting Debian running on that particular model of device. I suspect it will run on other Android tablets as well.
Can I just have a question?
Yes.
The Transformer, I think, is it an it's ARM-based, isn't it?
Yes, so the Transformer is an ARM-based tablet. It has a keyboard dock.
So wouldn't there be a way to impact on Debian?
Uh, so firstly, Debian for ARM-based CPUs will run on most Android devices natively if you wanted to hack your bootloader and install it. There's also lots of documentation on how you can install a Debian system into a cheroot jail on Android devices itself.
So
Which,
it leaves the bootloader and then Debian's shoot on after that.
yeah, or you can actually put it inside Android, inside what's called a jail. You can look this up. But it's basically a way of installing an operating system inside an operating system with the exception of its own kernel. And that basically means you can run anything that will run on Linux inside an Android system if you wanted to go that far. Most people don't, and I don't expect that if you went out and got a tablet, this is something that would be the first thing you'd want to do. Unless you're going out to get a cheap netbook with 15 hours worth of battery life. So on the flip side, there are many things that can't run directly on Android. X11 is a notable thing. So if you want to run KDE or GNOME stuff, you're out of luck. This is even in a Debian type cheroot thing. And you can't directly install things that depend on glibc unless you're putting inside a cheroot jail. Which means that you have to go through efforts to run things that directly target glibc. And a surprising number of things actually assume that you're using that specific C library, because it's not quite a POSIX C library, it has extensions on top of it. So if you only want to do terminal stuff, then Android is almost, for all intents and purposes, completely Linux. If you need GUI stuff, it's not quite the same. Okay, questions on that?
Sounds like you might as well just run a connect bot.
Well, I mean, if you run ConnectBot, which is an SSH client and terminal emulator for Android proper,
What was it called again?
ConnectBot. It's free and open source. You can get it on Google Code or on any of the Android marketplaces. And that's how you'd get to the terminal stuff if you want to run Debian inside your Android device. The user space utilities that come with Android aren't particularly good if you want to use it as a working shell. Like you really want to have, if you want to do serious terminal-based stuff on Android, you really want to have a proper shell like Bash or Corn shell, and those really won't run on Android out of the box, I don't think. Well, that's why I was suggesting the ASUS Transformer.
The Transformer is
Yeah. So the majority of my talk is going to be on Android as an open source thing, because it is an open source system for the most part, but it doesn't really participate in open source in the way that we've come to expect open source projects to participate. So it's worth looking at from that point of view. So there's this thing called the Android Open Source Project. You can see it at source.android.com. This contains information on how you can download the source repositories for Android. It tells you how to build custom images on devices that the Android Open Source Project supports. So lots of useful stuff for open sourcey stuff. And basically that consists of two things. It consists of the Android system, which is everything except the Linux kernel, and that's licensed under an Apache license, which basically says that developers can do what they want with it once they have the source code, as long as they give copyright attribution to Google. And then there's the Linux kernel, which is released under the GNU GPL version 2, which, if you're familiar with it, I won't need to tell you this, but if you're unfamiliar with it, says that if you release a device which has this software on it, you need to publish the source code and publish any modifications to the source code that you make. So every device that distributes Android needs to publish its own version of the Linux kernel containing all its device drivers and stuff like that. But it doesn't need to distribute its own version of the Android system. Now, Android's developed in a method that's referred to as a cathedral project. And this term was invented by Eric Raymond in the 90s. He compared it with so-called bazaar type projects. So cathedral projects are ones where all the development happens internally, and then when the thing is released, the product is released along with the source code. As opposed to bazaar type projects, which is ones where the source code is published while development is taking place. Development takes place in the open, and at some point a release is declared and they say, hey, this is stable. So Android doesn't have its source made available as development happens. A release is made of the source when they say, hey, this version of Android is Android 4.0, come and get it. So there's nothing leading up to the release of a particular version of Android. There are advantages and disadvantages to this. I won't go into those unless I get asked later on. One particular disadvantage was that Google decided that they weren't going to do a source release for version 3. They just said, nah, we're not going to do it. And they had no reason, they had no need to. There's nothing requiring them to do it. They just published their version of the Linux kernel, that's all they need to do. They didn't publish the Android user space or anything like that, which is very disappointing to a lot of people, but it highlights the fact that Google have ultimate control over this and have have the final say over whether something will be open sourced. And a lot of people were dubious as to whether version 4 would have its source code released at all. As it turned out, it did, and we're all happy for that, but we're now dubious as to whether Google will release things. The other problem with the Android open source project is that it actually runs on comparatively few Android devices that are out there. And devices can fall out of favor with Android as the project moves forward. So for example, the original Android devices that were released in late 2008, the Sapphire and the Dream by HTC, they stopped being supported by version 2.1, or they were only supported up to version 2.1, and then were only experimental in version 2.2, and now you just can't build for those devices. The Nexus 1, which was the flagship device that Google released to the public only 2 years ago, is no longer included in build support for the Android open source project, which is kind of disappointing in a way. I have a Nexus 1 and was using it quite as my regular phone until recently, but it wasn't supported by the Google open source project, which basically means there's no official support for Ice Cream Sandwich that's ever going to happen on it. Ice Cream Sandwich is version 4.0, by the way. That's the only time I'll ever say that name. I hate it. So yeah, those are the devices that is supported by the Android open source projects and the versions on which they run. As you can see, the range isn't particularly wide. For other devices, there's this project called CyanogenMod, which originally started off as a way of producing stock Android, so the Android open source project, on devices that weren't supported by the Android open source project. Or also the ones that were supported by the Android open source project, but they had to do extra work to get it to build on other devices, which is primarily what CyanogenMod ended up doing. They also make some nice customizations, but that's the main reason why you'd go and get it. They currently only have version 2.3 as a stable release. There'll never be a version 3 because Google never releases source to it. And version 4, because there was such a long time between version 2.3 and version 4, they're taking a long time to get CyanogenMod up to scratch, bringing features that existed in 2.3 into version 4, and making sure that it runs on all the devices that they expect it to support. And that's taken them a while. It's been 4 months since the source release to 4.0, and they still haven't got there. But there are experimental builds of CyanogenMod 9 that will run on all the devices except the Nexus 1 and that era of devices. So any device that will run 4.0, CyanogenMod has support for it at the moment, I think. And as I said earlier, one of the big problems with Android as an Apache licensed project is that the vendors aren't required to release their customizations, merely their changes to the kernel. So this means that if you get, say, an HTC device, they have their custom user interface stuff on top of it. Say you wanted to patch that, no chance. You can take everything that HTC provides, or you can go to stock Android and work off stock Android. You can't make modifications to what HTC publish. And it's the same for every device manufacturer that produces their own customizations. They don't release the source code back because they're not required to, and they need to be educated, basically. Another problem beyond this is another term that Richard Stallman invented called TiVoization. It's named after the TiVo, which is a set-top box that records things. It runs Linux, but there was no way that you could install your own builds of Linux onto a TiVo until Andrew Tridgell came along and made that work. But TiVo never intended for people to install their own versions of Linux on their devices. And this is the same with the vast majority of Android devices. They come out of the box trying to prevent you from installing your own versions of Android and your own Linux kernels on top of it. And basically every device ships without root access on it as well. This is fair enough. The Google devices come without root access provided, but you can very easily enable it. But the vast majority of devices, you can't get it at all without resorting to hacks. So this is a problem as well. So Android's open source, but you can't necessarily run your own software or your own systems on it. The Google Nexus devices, they're great. It's really easy to get root access and to unlock the bootloader so you can install your own operating systems on it. The tool that you can do this with is shipped with the Android SDK. The information on how you do it is on the Wikipedia page on rooting the Android OS. It's great. Very recently, HTC came out and said, we're going to unlock or make it possible to unlock the bootloader of every Android device we release from this point onwards. And when they said that, they did it. You can go to that website there, and every device that HTC say that they...
did go backwards on a few.
They went backwards on a lot of them, but they said every device from then on they would support unlocking the bootloader for. And that would be something that they actively encourage. Like they say, we welcome our users' innovations on our devices. It's actually encouraging people to go out and hack together their own operating systems for HTC devices, which is really...
Allow access to NAND.
Hey?
I didn't allow access to NAND, so you still can't actually do much of that for the hacking. So it's not fully open.
I'm not entirely certain of the details, but I'm fairly certain that you can install your own operating system images on it, which
You
is...
can.
Which is
Yeah. if you want to override the radio file,
yeah,
Yeah,
but
you-
there's issue...
it's the checksum.
Sure, there are reasons for that. In particular, that they can't sell the device in the United States unless they can certify that the radio is going to behave in particular ways. So if you want to get a telecommunications license to sell in the US, presumably in Australia as well, it has to be certified. So it makes sense that they don't let you overwrite that. But everything else, it's great. You can write over it. Install your own operating systems, do what you want with it, which is really cool as far as HTC devices are concerned. There are still plenty of vendors out there that won't let you do it. LG, quite a few Samsung devices won't. Motorola is a mixed bag. Some of them they will, some of them they won't, and some of them they won't to the extent that if you try to install your own operating system on it, your phone will be bricked. There's a link to basically every major Android device manufacturer on the Wikipedia page. Go check it out. Yes.
Those are to Dixon, but why would you want to get root on your phone?
Why would you want to get root on your phone? Well, firstly, it means that you can stuff it up as much as you like, which is great. It basically allows you to take control of the hardware of your phone in ways that wouldn't be recommended to a plebeian user. I have an example that I'll go through. You can go through next. Until version 2.3 of Android, there was no way to broadcast a Wi-Fi hotspot in stock Android. A bunch of hackers from Google in Sydney, I think, published an app that lets you that would let you broadcast a hotspot, but you'd need to be able to talk to the Wi-Fi driver on your phone, which requires root access. As an example, what was your example?
CPU clocking.
Sorry,
CPU clocking.
Oh yeah, so
Either overclocking
so
or
changing the
underclocking.
frequency of your CPU to either make it run faster or run slower so that it conserves battery life. Right. That's a really good example, actually. You can make your devices use a lot less power if you don't make the CPU run it.
HTC devices have absolutely atrocious.
Yeah, that's
usage.
pretty standard for most people who don't have a clue about Linux. Power management's kind of difficult unless you understand and have an expert working for you.
It's set to 100% the whole time.
Really?
The battery lasts about 4 hours if you like.
Okay, what I said about HTC devices, maybe not so much now. Or run actually, yeah, get CyanogenMod, run that, and that will probably have decent power management, I suspect. So yeah, get an HTC device and run CyanogenMod on
This
this.
is Samsung Galaxy, the first one. Telstra was shipping it with Android 2.1. The battery was dying in about 4 or 5 hours. Despite the fact that Android 2.2 had been out for a long time, which had fixed that problem. And so if the punters in the street were buying their phones and they were dying,
Yeah.
Places like this, we had IT people just going, let's just upgrade it and fix the problem.
Yeah.
But, it's been-
So yeah, buying a device where you don't have to.
No, that's another issue.
Yeah. So buying a device where the hardware manufacturer actively supports running your own software on it is quite a good thing. In particular, it means that if the vendor decides to give up on Android's upgrade cycle, which is not only not unheard of, it's quite frequent, it means that you can keep up with Android as it keeps on getting developed and your hardware manufacturer's given up on it. So, other issues as far as open source is concerned. The Android market, now known as Google Play, is completely non-free. It's a proprietary service. They don't make it possible to download the source of applications that have source available, not directly anyway. They don't tell you if an app is open source without the developer going out and saying, hey, this is open source, and people perhaps searching for open source on it. You know, it's not particularly open source friendly. It doesn't hate open source, but it still doesn't care about it, which is unfortunate as far as it being a Linux system is concerned, and we all love freedom, yay. There's an open source repository for Android called F-Droid. See this neckbeard here? It tells you that it loves freedom. But yeah, F-Droid is a free software repository for Android. It has a website as well as a client that can be used to download apps directly onto your phone. It tells you the licensing information, tells you how to get access to the source, and only accepts open source applications. So if you install F-Droid, you know, it will let you find open source things easier if you care about open source. I think probably the biggest irony about Android is that it's an open source system. There is no way to produce an application for Android without running non-free software on your computer. The entire thing is written in Java, so if you have a JVM, you can run it on your machine, but you can't actually get the source code to the Android SDK. Which also means that if you want to flash your Nexus device, or you want to unlock the bootloader on your Nexus device, you have to use a non-free program to unlock the bootloader, which I think is hilarious. But yeah, so this is unfortunate. Not much we can do about it beyond developing our own Android SDK. I'm not aware of any efforts to do that yet. It might exist, it might not. I believe things like the Dalvik compiler are open source, so you'd be able to do it. I'm just not certain whether it's been done yet. So finally, the Freedom Lovers Executive Summary to Android. If you care about freedom, get yourself a Nexus device. These ones run open source software when they're sold by the shops. So the operating system is completely open source. It is the most recent version of Android from the open source project. So if you get the Galaxy Nexus, it's running open source.
Can you just elaborate which applications which come with it will be open source?
Oh, so the operating system is open source. The Google apps that come with it aren't. So everything that's Google branded, Gmail, Google Calendar, Google Play, which is the new name for the Android market, they aren't open source, but basically everything else is. The email client that comes with it, not Gmail, the normal email client that comes with it is open source. Pretty much everything except the ones that have Google in their name are open source. Or particular trademarks like Amazon, if they still do that crap that they did with the Nexus one, where they make the the Amazon shop app uninstallable. That was annoying. I hope they don't do that anymore. I don't think they do. At least my Galaxy Nexus doesn't have it.
Why would you say the Nexus rather than Galaxies from Samsung?
Why would I
Seeing
say
they're almost the same
Why would I
brand.
say the Nexus devices? The Nexus devices come with an open source operating system out of the box. The Samsung Galaxy devices that aren't the Galaxy Nexus come with a Samsung customized version of Android. The Nexus devices all have directly unlockable bootloaders, so all you have to do to get root access on your phone is plug it in, download the Android SDK, and run this command. You can't do that with the Samsung devices in general. So the Nexus devices are completely open source. The rest of the Samsung devices aren't. Your next best bet is to get a recent HTC phone and shove CyanogenMod on it. Because HTC think it's really good that you can unlock their bootloaders, which I think is something that should be encouraged, but their operating system isn't open source, and you should get an open source operating system on your phone as soon as possible.
Do you find that, sorry, just because I dish out a lot of Android phones, an awful lot.
Yeah, sure.
And I would not give my punters a Nexus because it would cause me no end of pain. So, it's hard
No end of pain from what point of view, though?
I see a manager who doesn't like dealing with dead phones. So I understand the open source perspective, that's awesome, but I just want to flag that I would never recommend. I've got a Nexus in my hand.
Yeah, sure.
It's awesome with a kit when it works, but I wouldn't.
Okay, so you're talking about people discovering that they can brick their phone and then proceeding to brick it.
No.
Okay.
The phone's just dying on the wire, not constantly
Okay.
rebooting, hardware failing. There's the highest rate of failure of a device I've ever seen.
Interesting.
So I'm buying my stuff, the S2s, instead of the Nexus because.
Okay, sure, but be aware of the fact that Samsung don't say all these nice things that they say about open source when they talk about the Galaxy Nexus with the S2. I believe the rest of the Samsung devices are actually not particularly supportive of open source. So get an HTC device instead. Shove CyanogenMod on it. I'll say that quite often. Get root access, mostly from a symbolic point of view. You know, it says, hey, I've got full access to my phone and this is cool. But, you know, you can do things like setting your CPU frequency to not be at 100%, 100% of the time. And install F-Droid, see what apps are available on it, you know, support open source development efforts on Android. So that's the end of my talk. Are there any questions?
You'd have to get root access to install Debian in a Chirut jail.
Oh, of course you would, yes. Because you can't, because having a Chirut jail requires you to be able to run Chirut, which can only be run as root.
Indeed.
That was 3 different uses of the word root, all with subtly different meanings. Which is, thanks Unix people, we love you. Cool, so, questions?
I'd like to mention that the HTC fee.
So HTC do pay Microsoft for patent licensing on devices on devices that they make, because apparently Microsoft have said that HTC infringe on patents, and HTC has said, yes, we do infringe on your patents, we will pay you money. No commentary on that other than most phones that run Android do pay a nominal amount of money to Microsoft to license various patents that may or may not be valid.
Also standard tactics.
Yeah.
Yes.
Why infringers give us money? What?
So it's
protection. It's protection.
Microsoft make more money off most Android phones than Google do. It's quite ironic.
You probably find that Microsoft isn't the only company getting money. off patents.
Microsoft is by far the most significant, though.
But what I mean is, there's so many things that go into a phone. Just patents on just about every part of the phone. So just single out
Yeah,
Microsoft
sure,
is
but the thing is that the majority of them apply to the majority of patents on phones apply to hardware devices that exist in the phone, and they're licensed, and you know you'd pay for them as part of purchasing hardware anyway. And I think hardware patents are perfectly good and reasonable things to have, because they do protect a monopoly on developing hardware which has an explicit cost in production, which is what US companies manufacturing in China though. Software patents are a whole different kettle of fish thingy, and I could go into all the reasons why software patents are bad in another talk, but that would take another hour and a half at least, and I think we'd all rather go to the pub.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Yeah, Thomas.
I was just going back to something from the last meeting. Do you have any idea, or have you heard, if ARM devices, which are going to be designed to run Android, are likely to have secure boot enabled?
I think that secure boot, in the sense that Microsoft are pushing it, is going to be universally considered by the industry as a bad idea. In particular, because Android devices, there's a bucket load of Android devices out there on the market, and one of the cool factors of Android that people go out and get Android devices for is that they can customize it. And people say they like Android because they can customize it and they won't support devices that have secure boot on it. At least that's my point of view. When there are devices that don't have secure boot on it, and there are manufacturers that are saying, we're not going to put secure boot on our devices, we want you to be able to unlock your bootloader, it's going to be hard to market devices that have secure boot except to idiots. And I don't think idiots will comprise a large portion of the market.
I think the only look at Microsoft's market share compared to iPhone and everything else that's running ARM, and they're trying to come in and go, do what we say.
Oh, well, no, they're trying to come in and say, do what we say if you want to run Windows 8.
Yes. And what I'm saying is, with the market share they've got, they can't do what they used to do in the past with the Windows operating system and start dictating things because they're like, oh, okay, we won't bother with you.
They've got Nokia
Yeah.
in tow though.
They've got yeah, and Nokia doesn't have the market share it used to have either.
I feel
Yeah. So yeah, I suspect that secure boot's not going to be as an issue for Android tablets in particular. They may be issues for tablets that come with Windows that people want to run Android on because they'd rather run a free operating system, but they discover they can't because of the keys issue. But I don't think it's going to be an issue for the vast majority of Android devices that are in the wild.
What do you mean by keys?
Oh, so last meeting we talked about EFI Secure Boot, which is a mechanism by which only operating systems that are signed against a known publisher will be allowed to run on machines. And so the issue being that people who compile their own version of Android to run on an ARM-based netbook would not be able to do so if the thing came with Windows 8.
Also, for Matthew Garrett and secure boot.
Yes, go watch his talk from LCA 2012. There's plenty of British-style grumpiness in that talk that will bring across the gravity of the issue far better than I can.
You don't have to point necessarily blog comes pretty well as well.
In fact, watch a lot of the talks from LCA.
Yeah.
Well, actually, if you read his blog, you'll read the first one and then you'll go back through his entire archive and then spend far more than 40 minutes on the topic. He's quite a good writer.
Article.
Pardon?
Article.
What about the patents issue on Android?
Yeah.
So I heard recently that one of the things that they're claiming infringement of is the implementation in Java of the Python sorting algorithm TimSort, which I think is hilariously ironic.
I read the court transcript from today. So basically, they had the CEO of Oracle, whose name I can't remember,
Yes.
and the CEO of Google, whose name I can't remember which one it was. Basically, talking about what they've done, and what it comes down to is about 9 lines of code.
In TimSort,
Yeah.
which It's a sorting algorithm that was first published in an open source programming language, got adopted by Java when it was closed source, and is now being claimed under patent by Oracle, I believe.
If it's already in the public domain,
This is the question.
it can't be. I mean,
This is what is being
It's like you're
argued.
talking about lawyers, the lawyer stuff.
Yeah.
What makes sense and what's the law?
They won't be able to close the source. They'll just be able to seek compensation from whoever's stuffed up.
Well,
The
there's
other
questions they can even do that.
The other part of the court case as well is they're claiming copyright over their API.
But so the problem there is that they're claiming it on every. Also, the implementation of the Java API that is published by, also that is implemented in Android, is not the Sun or Oracle implementation of the Java API, which is, by the way, open source now and has been since 2006. It's actually an implementation made by Apache originally before Sun open sourced their Java library. So it's called the Harmony project, I believe. It's an alternative implementation of the Java library, which is what comes with Android. There's no source from Sun or Oracle in there, to the best of anyone's knowledge.
It should also be noted that Sun actually encouraged and praised Google for Android and for using Java.
Well, they don't actually use Java. That's a whole other story. A whole other story.
Yes.
I'm going to grammar Nazi myself. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks to F-Troll, I can now play Frozen Bubble on its own.
Great.
Like 3 times.
So, there being no further questions, I propose we go to... Oh, Craig?
One quick question, but tell me if you're a joke at the pub. Samsung are doing dual development on another platform they consider Android competitor as their Android backup. I know Rastaman's working there, if you guys know Enlightenment at all, he's the lead developer behind Enlightenment, he's using EVAS, the stuff to...
So
you
they're
know that platform at all? I think it's called something like Banjo or something silly.
I have not heard of any open source competitor to Android that is actively supported at the moment, other than the Mimo project, which was recently dropped by Nokia because their CEO owns Microsoft shares and not Nokia shares. Think about that.
Yeah.
They are still providing financial support.
They're providing financial support under a contract that they signed with Intel, which I imagine that they're going to drop the moment that.
There is absolutely no support currently.
We'll take it to the pub because
Yes.
it's
So, thank you for listening to me and thank you for telling me where I was wrong.
Right,
And before we run, guys,
You can. I'm not going to pay attention to you.
before we go, guys, I just want to remind everyone that